Okay, right. Well, today we're going to talk about a parish on the Black Isle in Scotland. That's just north of Inverness, the Black Isle. It's a trick. There's not really an island at all. And it connects fairly closely with the Urry parish that we saw not so long ago. The research has been done by Robin Peake. I'm really pleased that Robin did this because she's the daughter of the former secretary of the Clan Association in New South Wales, and it's great to see her pick up the reins where Graham left off. So that's our topic for today. You'll find what we're finding with so many of these presentations is that the parishes turn out to be quite different to each other. As usual, we'll talk about the topography, location, extent, and the produce that they have in that parish, and we'll cover something of the local people, you know, what they're like, what sort of things ordinary people do, and how they earn some income, how they live, what their diet and their health, their housing's like. We'll look at some McLennans who live there as an illustration of the sort of people who are there, the ministers and the heritors that are in that parish, and some curiosities. The curiosities are quite fun in this parish. I'm sure you'll look forward to that. So the parish we're talking about is, as I mentioned, just north of Inverness. And so you can see on this little map that's even part of the statistical account itself, this map, you can see KNOCKBAIN is written there. But in fact, the parish is, at this time known as Kilmuir, the United Parishes of Kilmuir and Suddy. Here's Inverness down here. On this old map, and just across the firth here is a ferry running over to the area of KNOCKBAIN where this parish is located. And the really identifying thing is this Munlochy Bay. Munlochy, the town, is just up there at the head of the bay, and is this is quite a significant item. You can see it easily on any map, so it's easy to find this parish. The neighbouring parts are along here, Redcastle, you see that there? Redcastle is a locality. And other places that you'll know, Culloden House. This name will be, you'll know this by the end of the meeting, Allen Grange, that's a place in this parish. So here you go. This is the page on the statistical account. You can see the United Parishes of Kilmuir Wester and Suddy. There's a Kilmuir elsewhere in the more easterly set, so it has to be called Kilmuir Easter. And this name, you can see here from the writing in here with the usual, you know, signifying with a thing that looks like an F that's actually an S. A church dedicated to Mary, or a church, or a, you know, this word kill, the prefix of a part of a word is a cell, like a, you know, like a monastery or a church, or a, you know, we use the term, don't we, for places where monks and the like live, monks cell. St. Mary, so this is just another version of Mary here. Suddy, it's called a good place to settle. That's what it means in the Gaelic. And the church itself is dedicated to this same saint that we saw in Tain when we looked at the Tain parish. Suddy is, we'll see it on a map where it is now soon. The name itself, KNOCKBAIN, that we use now and have used for a long time for this part of Scotland, actually just means, you know, knock is a common thing, Knockfarrell, names like that, places around Scotland. It means a small hill or a knoll, hillock. And Bain just means white, so this just means white hill. Nothing very clever about that, is there? In fact, I looked for a white hill, but there didn't seem to be one. So he wrote this statistical account in 1794, and he was known, he himself, the minister, had not been in this parish very long. He had been in Conton prior to this, and he, having just arrived here, he had already written the old statistical account for Conton. You remember Conton, it's a parish chock-a-block with McLennans, and it includes the Strathconan Valley, you might call it. So he came here in 1791, and he'd written the Conton Parish statistical account prior to coming here. So he's got runs on the board, known as Pastor Rory. And this is our usual map that you can get by going to the Clan webs page and clicking on the documents link, and then looking for maps, and you see this map of the parishes of Easter Ross. And here's KNOCKBAIN in here. You can see it's rather a sort of back to front L shape. Here's Munlochy Bay that we saw a minute ago. And then you go up and in about halfway across the Black Isle, back down through the middle of it, you might say. And then a sort of L shape appears around there. And here's Inverness right opposite. Some of the other places that we've seen in our travels, not just Inverness, but you know, you've got Tain up here. You've got Allness that we've already covered. We've got McLennans that we're going to do before too long, aren't we, Helen? We've got Urry just over here quite close. And next door, you've got this parish of MacLennan. The two really work together. The landowners in this parish are living in this parish and that sort of thing. And, you know, you've got the Firth coming through there and Fort George up here, of course. So that's how, and Conton over here. And you know, the Conan flows out into this Firth here, and the Ness and the River Bewley flow into this Firth. Here's an old map that shows a few more things than we've seen before. You can see again the headland here, and then coming back down. This is where Fort George is. Fort George, it says there. That's not a date, that's the measurement. Must be from London, I think. 167 miles and a half, maybe. And then Inverness here, and the ferry going across. You can see it says ferry there. And then Kilmuir. You see that little dot there? Shows you where Kilmuir. It's right on the coast, Kilmuir. This particular map doesn't have Suddy, but it's actually, Suddy is up just about here. And then it says KNOCKBAIN there. And Kessock, that's a word you'll see quite often in this context. That's the land just here at the other side of the ferry, as it was then. Looking along here at Urry that we saw a couple of meetings ago, you see some places that we heard about when we were talking about Urry. One of them is Highfield House. Here it says River Conan there, see that? And then Gilchrist is the name of a former church and still church. I think there's still a church there, a burial ground, Gilchrist. And probably that's just another variation again of kill, you know, like we saw a minute ago, Kilmuir. There's some, okay. So that's where we're talking about. Now, just look at the topography of this same place. So here's your Munlochy Bay that we saw, the characteristic thing. Here's today's Inverness. You know, here's the Firth, here's Fort George up here. This is Culloden down here. And here's our parish. So the boundary goes along there, comes in up a little bit that way, over to the middle, across that way a bit, back down here, and then across that way and back down to this point. And Kessock is in here. What's the thing? You can turn your mic on. What's the thing you see about looking at this parish?
Lots of agricultural land.
Well said. So looking at this map, and this actually is a map from historic forts of Scotland. And these little yellow dots here indicate where there are former forts. And you can see that there are some areas that have trees on them, which are today's plantations. So now let's look by comparison to the one that Kathy did last meeting, the parish where we just heard talk about, you know, they grow potatoes and barley and so on. But look at the difference in even today's terms, where we have more technology and whatnot to allow us to cultivate areas. Look how much area is under cultivation in Lochalsh. Although they're growing the same crops and we could have the same list of things that they produce there, look what you're growing it on. Where are the fields? They're all just little patches around the edges, aren't they? Just little tiny patches here. Look at this little bit here where there's some agriculture today. Not much. So, you know, how interesting is that to compare the two topographies between and you Canadians would know about this, wouldn't you? These areas in Canada, the Shield and all that. How you have areas that are not suitable for growing anything much. And then going back to the previous one, look at the difference. Whoa, so marked, huh? And so it's no surprise then that the minister in the old statistical account says that KNOCKBAIN yields a much greater quantity of grain than is sufficient to support the inhabitants. No surprises there, huh? And that's what we're seeing. And it affects everything we're going to talk about from here on in this meeting.
This picture looks a lot like Southern Ontario, where I live.
That's it. Exactly.
You're looking at it from the air.
Exactly. All those patches. Yeah. No townships, though.
We have townships.
I know you do. That's what I'm saying. None here.
Oh, no.
So I want you to just look at this thing that I pointed out a minute ago. This little area where this dot is actually a hill that has planted fir trees on it today, pine trees, you might call them. And of course, this is where the modern bridge goes across, the spectacular bridge. Some of you will know that bridge, huh? It's a very prominent feature and sort of dominates the landscape now. You almost don't see that hill on the other side that was once so important. This is a picture before the bridge was built, obviously, and that's a motorized ferry there going across to the other side from this pier here. But you see how much this feature stands out on the opposite bank to Inverness, the Ord Hill, as it's called. I suppose there it's got plantings on it. That's an interesting thing. And it falls away quite steeply on the eastern side. The bridge was built only in 1982. That's quite a recent time, isn't it? But very dramatic. So moving around, I'll just go back to that again. So if we go along to this side here on the shore, on the northern side of the firth, this is what you see there. The hill falls away very rapidly from Ord Hill, and down here you have like more a fishing village than anything, right on the shore. And this is Kilmuir down there, the place that we've talked about a few times already. And this is the church that was there that gave the name to that former parish that was united by the time of the statistical account. And it dated back to the pre-Reformation times, well before the 15th century, 1400s, this church dates back to quite early place. And here is the ruin of that church and still being used today as a burial ground, the kirkyard. And this, because it was on the very edge of the parish, the combined parishes, they moved the church to a more central position. This is the photo from the good Rossin Cromarty Roots headstones site. It's showing a picture of this burial ground. Every one of those Rossin Cromarty Roots headstones that has a McLennan on it is already in our database. We've been through all of them and put them all in. So let's look at the people who lived in this parish. That's the most important thing now. There's some spectacular things to learn from this analysis. There are, normally this sort of number, about a bit under 2,000 people in most of the parishes. This one has 1,805 in the time we're talking about, the early 1790s. But look at the Webster census, and you can see that there were only 668 in this parish, a little over a generation before. One generation, it's nearly trebled the population. That's spectacular, isn't it? It's a huge change. And the other things that we see about this are that there are quite a lot of children. That there are of that only 400. About 450 odd are under 10. You can see there that 1355 are over 10. He says the people are generally in good health, although not long lived. Not many people living into their 80s. Not so well known, not long lived. And some of these people, he explains the increase in population by the fact that the Lairds are encouraging people to come and take up what he calls wastelands, meaning areas that hadn't previously been cleared or brought into cultivation or were unsuitable for cultivation, to live on them and try and make something of them. The other thing that's really interesting about this place is that there are far, far more women than there are men. You can see there are 1,100 women for 700 men. That's hardly equal distribution, is it? And he explains that by saying that he feels that the men perhaps had harder working lives in their early years and didn't live as long. That he says generally people eat little meat and little milk, so they're suffering from that, and mainly rely on eating oats and potatoes for their diet. Can I suggest that with all that grain available, it would be rare for them to go hungry the way people did on the West Coast and had to resort to bleeding their animals to survive the winter and so on. These people are more got much more stored grain, and although they're relying on potatoes and oats to live, they're not going to be short of it, I suggest, given the surplus. Melanie? Yep, I'm with you.
Yeah, it's too bad we don't know. Oh, sorry.
You're right.
Am I in? I'm in.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
It's too bad we don't know what the makeup is of the 668 in 1755. It's so soon after Culloden. I wonder if that number may have been a lot of women to start with.
And of course, men going off to wars are more likely than women going off to wars.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
And being shipped away for various reasons.
The fort being in Inverness was a big recruiting base.
Yeah, quite close. I had an interesting thing come out of yesterday. We here in Australia don't use the word meal to apply to human oats. I don't know what you call porridge. What do you call raw porridge?
We call it oatmeal.
Yeah, us too. Or
Same
we call
here.
it rolled oats. That's the more common term here.
Yep.
Rolled
Rolled
oats.
oats or steel cut oats.
Oh yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah, but we don't call it meal. And Hamish, the wonderful Hamish, he said, he said, I can remember when my dad used to go down to Munlochy and buy the meal, he said, and I said, what animals was he feeding with the meal? And he said, it was our porridge. They use the term, they shorten oatmeal down to just the meal.
Mhm.
We would use meal for stock feed. It's a big thing in flour mills and the like to make meal for stock feed. But anyway, so that was an interesting little term. Obviously it's still used. And there's that other word, what's it called? Boys or something, that means when you add water to the meal, that's what you call it. But if you add milk to the meal, you call it porridge. To the meal, meaning the grain. So that's, people still living on meal today.
Gruel.
Gruel, not gruel. No, there's another word in Scotland. That's a good point, though. Gruel.
Not groats. Groats.
Okay. No, not gruel. So he says that in the year before he wrote, 2 years before he wrote this statistical account, there were 45 births and 20 marriages. And he says that, as is usual, that nobody knows the number of deaths because they're not recorded. That's the normal thing in the 1790s.
Bruce,
Peter, who's that? Sorry, Donald.
Bruce, is there any record of why did he mention they were not long lived? I mean, was that in relation to other areas in Scotland or in relation to other periods that?
Well, you might remember we saw that in Lochalsh last week, there were quite a few people living into their 80s and 90s.
Mm-hmm.
That's why he commented. He's just talking from experience, I guess.
Right.
He just didn't see many people. I mean, he would know all these people, wouldn't he? Although I think
That kind of population explosion, if people were not long lived, they certainly must have been having a lot of children.
Yeah, I guess. That's a good point, Donald. Melanie, you're going to say?
Well, it could. I know that a friend of one of Vandy's cousins, his wife is from Newfoundland and from a very small community that's very old. And there's actually some really interesting studies being done on these people because their genetic variety was so tight for so
Mhm.
long that they're now suffering with a lot of diseases, and people always historically died young in the community. Now they're figuring out the reasons why, and a lot of it's genetic. So when you have kind of a tight pocket of people and not a lot of fresh genetic material, sometimes like you may have a chronic heart condition that shows up and runs in families or something like that.
Mm.
And
have
also
to-
it's
you have to learn more.
Applecross. Can
Yeah.
you hear me?
Yep.
And you think of the lack of variation in these people's diet, Melanie. That's another aspect. I mean, now that Prue's been in hospital for more than 2 weeks, I've been doing more shopping than I would usually do. And I went into the supermarket and I thought, by comparison with these people we're looking at here, I thought, my God, the people who we're talking about, they would have no idea about a thing like this that had so much stuff available. Aisle after aisle of just, I mean, it's just unimaginable when you were used to eating oatmeal for every meal of every day, and only in the season occasionally got a few herrings to throw in with them and spuds. Yeah. It's just like, I mean, I know it's a trap as well, but it's just not possible to think of what it was like. So another way of analysing the population is to look at how many of them were tenants and how many were cotters. We know this term cotters, you remember from when we did the Tain parish. He calls them more cottagers, but or mealers, occasionally he uses that word too. But we use the more common word cotter. And, you know, there are quite a lot of tenants. We discovered, didn't we, Kathy, this fantastic births record in Lockhouse just the day after the session last time. And it had a list of all the, you know, the baptisms, and it had the occupation of the father, you know, of the child, and just had tenant. It was a really, really old document, all falling apart at the bottom and all musty, and it had like tenant. So many tenants in that Seaforth controlled parish. It was funny, wasn't it, Kathy? You still there? Hello.
Yeah, it was good. It was, I mean, it was neat to see it. And we got to see one occupation that I was having a hard time even getting any information about, and he was a weaver.
Okay, that's a good point. We'll just come to that in 1 minute.
Okay.
So you can see here, you know, the number of cotters exceeds, it's sort of 4 times the number of tenants. So you got people who are more transitory, really, these cotter types. They just come to work and live on the land, but not have the arrangement to own and use the land the way a tenant does.
Chris, would you mind explaining what a cotter is? I'm not familiar with that term.
We dealt with it in the Tain session, Donald. It is a person who, in principle, they come and rent the land, but typically in former times, they rented the land by paying for the use of the land in labour or some other form of kind. You know, they didn't pay in money, that's what it means. They paid by offering a day's labour or 2 days' labour or something to the tenant, maybe more. Maybe they just permanently work for the tenants or the lairds. The person who
really short terms on how long they could have the property, nothing long or written out.
Yeah, that's it. You know, they can be moved on and told they're not wanted anymore, just like a labourer said, you know, knock up a house, that sort of thing. So that's a cotter. It's a term, and actually it's a good point, Donald, that you raised, because we start to see in this parish where money is more common than it was on the West Coast. We're starting to see the payment for using the land to build your house on, or the rent by the tenants as well to the laird, to the actual heritors, being paid in money, not in kind anymore. Like in former times, the tenants would pay their rent in grain collected or fish collected, or, you know, 1 in every 10 cattle they sent to market the proceeds would go to the heritor, but not here. We're starting to see them move away from this more barter type system to the more monetary economy that we know today. You raised a good point, Donald. Thank you.
Really?
And,
Otters are called woofers on Salt Spring. I've never come across that.
woofers, that's good. How do you know when you see a woofer?
It's a farm labor primarily.
Uh-huh. And as you'd expect, there are quite a few widows there because there are so few men, just a much smaller number of widowers. And there are 35 poor. The poor is quite amazing in this parish because he says, until recently, there used to be 3 times the number of poor that there are today. But in recent times, the Kirk Session had got together and decided that they would make it a requirement of being on the poor roll that you agreed to hand over all your wealth when you died to the church. That was a condition of being on the poor roll, and suddenly 2/3 of the roll disappeared. That was a good trick. Cut the poor roll down. Okay. So let's look at the crops and so on. There's a huge amount, 1,200 hectares under tillage. Obviously, arable land is the big deal, you know, not so much on the very coast itself where we see those hilly areas, but most of the inland area is rich and deep soil and quite a lot arable land. The crops are grown, sown early in summer and brought in, harvested in the end of summer, and done earlier in this parish than most of the others. So they get a bit of a premium in the market because they get in earlier with their things, and they're regarded as a superior product for the brewer, the distiller, and the mealmonger. There you go. I mentioned before, yields a greater crop than is needed by the local people, and it's sold just across the water in Inverness. That's a big attraction of this parish, that it's got proximity to the market there. It's a little bit like an exaggerated version of what we saw around Tain, really. And also to this place, if you don't know this name, Ferntosh, it's spelt in various ways, but it's a part of the parish that we more commonly know as Urquhart and Logie Wester, just to the north of this parish, just across the other half, you might say, of the Black Isle on the north side. He says barley, though, is a bit, doesn't yield very well, although it grows, it doesn't yield very well because of the wetness of the soil. He says timber is that, trees are starting to be planted in plantations for, you know, culling later. These are typically fir trees, pines, and they're planting them specifically to make what you would call lumber, you know, timber for house building and whatnot. Not so much for, and not so good really for heating or anything. We'll get onto that in a sec. And herrings are caught in the Firth just in the season between autumn and spring. It surprises me they're caught over winter, but there you go. That's what it says. This is a typical sort of scene of in there. This is my photo taken from near Munlochy, looking back across that feature that we talked about. So now we're moving around up to the head of the, you know, we've been out on the Firth looking at Ord Hill. Now we're coming along, back in along Munlochy Bay, and we're looking out across some of these wheat fields that we saw so much in the aerial shots. You know, here's some wheat sort of escaped on the edge of the road. And this geological feature here, the Drum Durfit, I think I would, it's a bit hard to know how to pronounce it really. I asked the Scots how they pronounce it yesterday and they weren't sure either, so I don't feel too bad. Anyway, Drum Durfit Hill Ridge here is very important to our clan, and we'll get to that in a minute. This is quite a feature, looking back from Munlochy Township. So recent improvements to agriculture. He says that the older farmers are, you know, sticking with the old ways, really, that they won't be persuaded to adopt new methods of farm management, like rotating crops, like putting fences so that animals don't trample on the new shoots, using fertilizers, manures, as they call them. He says that they're in the habit of sticking to the old ways. They're resisting change. Although that's despite the fact that the heritors who own the states where they have labour are providing an example of how to do these things, and many of them moving quite well into more scientific methods of agriculture. In particular, the Mr. Mackenzie, who owns the estate of Allen Grange, a name that we've already mentioned in our talk today, has reclaimed 30 hectares of wasteland, and by draining it, that is, you know, it's like a boggy area that he's drained and reclaimed it, and is now producing fertile, you know, productive crops. He says that the Allen Grange estate owner expects his tenants to practice the new methods of crop rotation and the like. But he says it in the sense that he thinks that's what's expected of them, but they're not always doing it. I noticed that there are a huge number of ploughs in this district. You know, if you think that there are, well, if you take the kids away, you've got, you know, 1,300 and something people, and then you've got take the you know, other people. That means that there's probably almost a plough for every one or two men of working age, you might call it. Quite a lot of ploughs. Only a couple of them use horses to pull their ploughs. I guess that means the most of them use bullocks. It's the sort of thing we're learning from other sessions, isn't it? And he says the heritors would like to see longer leases by their tenants, but the tenants are quite happy just to stick with what they know. And he says that already one of the estates in the parish, that's this one called Belmarduthi, has already under cultivation 200 hectares of plantation trees that are almost ready for harvesting. So that's well on the way there. One of the bits of bad news about this parish is that the peat, what he calls the mosses in the district are exhausted. There are none left. So that's not the usual peat to heat their homes and do their cooking, which means they have to resort to the coal, which we know had the tax, although he does mention, because he's writing the account a bit later, that there's a plan to remove the tax. And the plantations, of course, are just pine trees and don't provide very good long fires for cooking. So they might get a few branches and things fall off those, but really they're not that good as a source of firewood. The trades are very interesting too in this parish. You've got a lot of separate trades that, you know, the sort of thing we saw emerging in Tain, but even more so here, we're seeing people becoming sort of dedicated tradespeople practicing their craft apart from agriculture, so things other than agriculture itself. Look at the number of shoe and brogue makers. 49. When you think how many, you know, like there are not going to be many women who call themselves shoe or brogue makers, are there? And so, you know, you think that's a big percentage of the male working population. 5 blacksmiths, 17 square and cartwrights and millers. So millers are going to be a good part of that, I suspect. I'm not really sure what a square right is. That presumably has a hyphen with it. A square right. It's not a square wheel, I don't think. Anybody has any ideas, you can tell me. And you have 11 maiden lasses keeping house. That's always handy to have a few of those, maiden lasses keeping house. But look at this number here, weavers, 41 weavers, nearly as many as there are shoemakers, and 18 tailors. Presumably these two work together. You know, weavers, that's a lot of weavers. And we'll see in a sec what that looks like. And this is some other smaller numbers. 1 fiddler, 4 pipers, 3 gardeners, 1 exciseman, 9 whiskey sellers, 1 regular innkeeper, 6 distillers of whiskey, and enough people to run a ferry boat. This is an example of the weavers. I just want to emphasize how many weavers there are here. And, you know, this is what their weaving machine would look like, a wooden one. This is from the Highland Folk Museum, a picture of, you know, it's not in action, of course. That's a typical thing a weaver would use. And these are people who are about to be replaced, you know, when the steam engine gets in full swing and power looms become much more common, popular. And in a way, it's a pity that this parish didn't pick up the idea of manufacturing wool, you know, based on the fact they already had weavers there. The steam engine was about to come into play. I know there were steam engines at that time, but that, you know, wasn't widely installed in things, not in ships until the 1850s and 60s and later. Transport. This is that same picture where we saw the motor ferry going across. This is meant to be. It's a picture from the North Kessock Historical Society showing a picture of the ferry going across when it was a sail ferry, as it would have been in this time. The short distance, just a couple of kilometres across there, it saves a 35-kilometre journey around by land through Bewley and back to Inverness. So it's a good exercise to take the ferry. The ferry is operated by Mr. Grant, who we know is from Redcastle, and that's a part of the McLennan parish that is next door on the left-hand side when you go across from Inverness. He says the minister says the roads and bridges are in excellent condition, and you're able to avoid paying the road tax by doing 6 days work a year. I guess there were taxes on everything. Remember we saw that last time? And the access to the sea for this parish up the Munlochy Bay and also out on the Firth side here is good for carting things in and out of the parish, and particularly heavy articles are able to be brought. And there's a postal route that goes off to Inverness twice a week. So that makes it fairly connected by post, nearly as good as the internet. Who were the lairds in this parish? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? There were 8 heritors, 5 of whom lived in the parish, and apart from one who was off in North America with his regiment, Colonel Graham of Drynie, which is a part just behind the Ord Hill there. He was off, you know, fighting the rebels in the 13 colonies. We don't have many Americans here today, do we? We're nearly all Canadians. I can say these things with some freedom. And Mrs. Mackenzie of Suddy, they live in the parish, many of them. And a couple of the others live next door in Killianan, as I mentioned. 2 of the families live in Killianan. This is the name. This is names like Killianan is Kilcoy and Redcastle. They're the mansions in Killianan parish, and were at one time separate parishes. This is a sort of conflicting statement he makes. He says property has been changing hands fairly frequently. Then he says, but no new property owners have entered the district for 50 years, except for Mr. Grant. So I don't know what that means. It seems in conflict to me. I don't know whether they're changing hands frequently or not. I suspect not, probably. That's what this means more clearly. It brings in this much rent. He says that some that has been paid in barley and oats previously is being paid in cash. They're moving towards it, see here, trend towards converting all their rent to money as opposed to being in kind. And then he says that only rent that's assessed in kind these days is to do with the minister's stipend. So these are just some of the estate names that these heritors relate to. There's the Drynie that we talked about, Colonel Graham, who's off in North America fighting the rebellious 13 colonies. And the other names are Alan Grange, we've seen that before. Suddy, we've seen before, that's Mrs. Mackenzie's estate up there. This is where the border comes up here like this, and round here, and then and round, and then back down this way and round to the point, Munlochy Bay. These grey areas are just showing a couple of other reference points. So there's Munlochy there at the head of the bay. You can see the township there. This is the ridge here known as Drumdurford. This is Ord Hill in here, you can see. And here are these two estate mansions that I mentioned before. Redcastle out on the coast, right there, very close. Some of you have seen that. It's a red brick building in ruin. And Kilcoy is another name that you know from this context, and that's just in there, very close to this road that goes to the Tor roundabout, which is here, this roundabout in here. See that? You know the term roundabout, don't you? Rotary, some people call it in the US. Not a four-way stop sign anyway. Yeah, so the lairds that own property in here are based at these castles in here. These castles or mansions would be a better word. So that's some of the names. The other names I'd like you to take note of is this one here. Belmarduthi is a property here that is actually related to the Kilcoy Mackenzies, and some of the laird of the Mackenzie of Kilcoy is the styling of their title, later become the Mackenzies of Belmarduthi. So that's how important this becomes to them, as more important than they give that as their name of their title rather than this same family. And then you got this other name. I want you just to check that out. Balnakyle or Belnakyle, sometimes just the same word as there, really. That's what I want you to note. And I just came across this map here, looking at the various maps for this parish, and I thought this was interesting. Just if you're doing your research, this is a resource that's available to you. You know, I pointed out before that you can go to the NLS, meaning the National Library of Scotland, and you can. I've left this on here so you can see it's National Library of Scotland, and you can see here that it's got this web address, maps.nls.uk, and this particular item is that number there. But the thing I want you to note is that this is a map not of like a normal whole area covering an area. It's actually a plan of a state, you know, a farm, and areas allocated to different people. And in this particular one, you can see that word that we just saw a few minutes ago, Belnakyle, or Bailnakyle, it's written there, but it's the same place, obviously, within KNOCKBAIN. And on the top of it here, you've got a little area there which says, if you can't read it, it's a bit small, I know, but it says Croft of Rory McLennan. How about that? So if you were looking, your ancestor lived in this part of the world, you might well find this is the exact spot where he lived, and there's the map showing him on the map. That'll be good for your history about him, won't it? You can put a map of his place. This name itself is written all sorts of ways. It's often written M-U-L without an E there, and then B-U-Y. That's a more modern thing, or U-I-E sometimes. They're all variants of the same name. It's a useful thing though, isn't it? They've got these estates, some not for all, of course. If they got any, they've got them there digitized, and you can go and look at them. So that's a handy thing to know about. Let's talk now about the minister himself. I mentioned a bit about him earlier. Born in 1751, died in 1935. He replaced a minister in this United Parishes who was the son of the former minister of part of those United Parishes, Suddy, or it's spelled there with an IE, but it's the same name, who was described as well-loved but ineffectual, Robert Munro. And you can see there that Robert Munro, his predecessor, died in 1791, so it's no surprise then that he was called in 1790 1790 he died, so no surprise that he was called in 1791. He'd been educated at the school at Cromarty, that's just up on the tip, of course, on the eastern side there. And he was educated further at his qualifications at the King's College, which is a famous institution in Scotland that goes back for many centuries. Yeah, very old institution. It says he was called amid violent opposition from Conton. Now, you remember Conton has a lot of McLennans in it, and many people left the church there in disgust because he was, you know, dragged away from them. This is a rather immodest description of this minister. I doubt he wrote it about himself. I found this in the Fasti, I think, not in the account that he wrote. It describes him as of unbounded charity, tall with broad shoulders, stood well above 6 foot, and one of the finest looking Highlanders of his day. That's a rather immodest way of describing someone, isn't it? Especially for Scots, tall poppy business. Yeah, he married Mary Grant, presumably while he was a minister in Conton. They had 6 children, and 2 of those children sadly died overseas, not in Scotland. You know, this is the time when Scots are getting out to the world, isn't it? He seems to have mixed feelings, the person who did the research notes, that he describes, in the one hand, his parishioners as being, his congregation as being honest and hardworking, and then on the other hand, he describes them as being indolent and backward. And he advocates for bringing in some people to have some more money they could spend on, you know, drainage and improvements to the land rather than following the old practices. So we're starting to see this term indolent and backward, that sort of description by the ministers, quite commonly, aren't we, around these statistical accounts. And I think we should, over this and future meetings, try to understand better what they mean by that, why they use that description and what they mean by it. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Sounds very confronting and unpolitically correct to us today, doesn't it?
My husband sitting beside me here suggests perhaps they weren't contributing enough to the church.
Yeah, maybe.
If
Anybody?
they're backward, maybe it's because they're not adopting the new practices of crop rotation.
And maybe reluctant to learn to read and write. He might be frustrated by, you know, having been so well educated himself, and they not, you know, don't send their kids to school and those sorts of things.
He does mention some of the farmers that were the, you know, keeping to the old ways as being poorer. And maybe that, you know, reluctance to be more progressive was holding them back from being more affluent.
So I think this is not something we're going to solve today, but I think we should try and understand better what we're seeing here. We can't ignore it because we're seeing it so often, huh, in these accounts that we're looking at. So let's continue that theme, and if you have any thoughts between now and future meetings, by all means come back to us and discuss them. He describes the stipend as not being particularly good. This church actually in this picture isn't the current, is the current church, and not the one that was there in the 1790s. This was built quite recently in the 1920s. When we say recently, 100 years ago. But you can see there, KNOCKBAIN Church. The church that he occupied was slightly to the southwest of Munlochy. That's sort of coming back towards Inverness, really. Not far, a couple of kilometres out of Munlochy. He describes it as being poorly situated on a cold, windy and bleak moor. He paints a rosy picture. It's fairly flat there. It's actually near, I don't know if you've ever been there, but as you head towards Munlochy, there's a fork in the road and there's a war memorial on that fork. It's very close to that, apparently. I haven't been to see the ruin myself. but that's apparently where it is, near there. And this one isn't that far away from there. He says there are no papists, you know, meaning Roman Catholics, in the parish, and no Methodists either. But there are 200 odd Episcopalians. By that he means like Church of England, you know, to do with bishops, allowing bishops in the church, being told where to go and so on. And but he doesn't seem to have very good relations with the Episcopalians in general, because he says that when it comes to the number of births amongst the Episcopalians, he can't find out how many there were. He doesn't know whether the minister of that church keeps records or not. And you'd think he might have asked if he's writing the statistical account for the sort of government of the day. Anyway, he wasn't going to do that. Maybe a bit proud, I don't know. So that's the manse and the church. This is the former church. We looked already, you remember, at the church at Kilmuir early on when we were looking at Ord Hill. And this is the church that's more up in the northeast of the now United Parish. And you can see all these headstones around the former church there still. It became disused, of course, once the new central church was built and occupied that he was using. And here's a headstone, one of our, you know, McLennans, buried in, died in 1898, is somewhere in this churchyard. You can see you've got real people there. And you can see in the background the sort of country that it is, you know, like fields, as we know. Schools. I know a lot of you are interested in the education and, you know, why they did it and how they did it and so on. He says there are 3 schools in the parish. One has the typical sort of number that we're seeing, about 50 or 60 students who attend the parochial school. That's the one funded by the, well, the Lairds, but of course, people contribute by rent towards that. And the schoolmaster has a dwelling that has slate on the roof, provided as part of his remuneration, and an area for his kitchen garden, kale yard, and a salary of 200 merks. Now, I didn't know once how much 200 merks was worth, but I think 200 merks, whatever it translates to, maybe like 80 pounds or something, is a lot more than 16 pounds that the other school is getting. This school here, the society school, you remember these schools that were set up by the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, was a undercover Hanoverian indoctrination institution to make good English folk of them, turn them into Englishmen. And the girls particularly were taught trades like spinning and weaving and other similar things, sewing. So there's a school there with 35 to 45 children. And also there's a Sunday school that's been provided by Mr. Grant, you remember, from Redcastle, the new proprietor, where there are 100 odd poorer students who are taught to read English and Gaelic, and has paid himself for all the expenses of running the school. He's even intending to open the school during weekdays for even more benefit to the community. So that's quite a generous thing to be doing. As a little aside, you know, the researcher got this picture of, we know what these are. Anybody going to guess what they are? Come on, we know. We're old enough to know these things.
Bed warmer.
Bed warmer. No, inkwells. You can see the ink splattered about everywhere. But of course, you know, she's put this picture in here, the researcher. But there were no steel nibbed pens in those days. No pens as we would know them in schools. We had ink nib pens, steel nib pens when I was at primary school. And but because they weren't invented till many generations later. They were about the 1840s or so. Steel nibbed pens came in, and fountain pens were even quite a bit after that. So they would have used feathers to do their writing here, and a feather is quite an inconvenient way to write because they need to sharpen it every day to keep it working. Yeah, so there you go. That's education. Anybody want to ask any more about education? Questions or discussion?
I think that it's, you know, Charles Grant, I mean, that's really progressive and very similar to community centers, you know, that are now. I mean, you know, to make it available to people. I think that's fabulous.
And, you know, the interesting thing about this is that this is one of these incoming recent landlords, not the traditional landlord for that area. That's a, you know, like he's bringing these more modern ideas that people need education as a newcomer, as a new laird in the parish, in the area. Well, he lives in Cullinan, but it's right next door, and these are his tenants. So, you know, people, we've seen the examples that are quoted so often in, you know, clearances and all that sort of talk of the dastardly new landlords renting out the properties and kicking off the tenants. But here we've got the new owners with the money, obviously, coming in and using it to educate the children. You can quote examples from different things, can't you? The housing, well, this is what we expect, isn't it? You know, black houses with thatched roofs, fairly temporary to put up. Just put up some stones with some mud between, and there you got your walls and some timbers over the top and some thatch on that. I guess they didn't use heather so much for thatching, more straw and so on. And the hole in the roof, that's why you've got this. Oh, that's a handy spot to have the marker, isn't it? The shaft of light coming down from the one hole in the roof to let the light out. No windows, fire there, burning to heat the pot that has the gruel in it, and goes cooking all day because we know they didn't have matches to relight the fire if it went out. Homemade furniture. You know, this is a sort of typical picture you expect. The minister describes this parish as being healthy, and he uses for that the excuse that air circulates freely within the parish because there are no high mountains or forests to restrain the vapors, you know, to restrain the air from moving freely. He thinks that's why they're so healthy. Of course, this is such 1700s thinking, isn't it, till before people knew that diseases were spread by inadequate sanitation and the like, you know, that they thought it was the vapors, didn't they, in those days?
Bruce, why were there no windows in the houses? Was that because of construction?
No glass.
Techniques?
No glass.
Or what?
No glass. There wasn't widespread making of glass until it started about this time.
Right.
And you don't want to have holes for the blizzards to come in.
What did mansions do?
Mansions.
Well, they put glass in, but there was a window tax.
Yeah. The tax on everything. Just that's all we have to remember. Tax on everything.
It was considered such a luxury. It was taxed that way.
Exactly.
My goodness. All right.
There was even hearth taxes. So some people would have a fire like this on the ground in their house, no chimney, no mantle or hearth. And then when the tax collector would come, they'd sweep the ashes out onto the road.
Tax on everything, Donald. That's all you have to remember. That'll be on the exam, that one.
Right.
A tax on ... Complete the sentence.
Avoiding taxes is a long tradition.
So no smallpox in this parish the way it affects other neighbours. They mainly eat the oatmeal, as we know, potatoes, and the wonder crop, and probably that is the big explanation for the booming population. They have some fish occasionally that they mix in with the potatoes or the oatmeal. Very little milk or meat, we saw that before. But he also comments that there is quite a lot of stone available for quarrying in this parish. And in fact, he says that some of the stone that was used to build the monster white elephant Fort George, not to protect against foreign enemies, but to suppress the Highlanders, in brackets, was built from quarries in this parish. The stone was carted across to the other side of the Firth there for making Fort George, and also that the stone can be used for house making, house building, you know, so you get a better house. In fact, it also says that some of the lairds have started using clay for brick making. There's apparently quite a good supply of clay suitable for brick making. This is the Black House we've been talking about. And he says that the language, of course, is the Gaelic. Some people have both Gaelic and English in this parish. So we are starting to see a bit of English coming in.
What did they have as a light source indoors? Would it have been candles, or did
Not
they
much.
have lanterns at that point?
Not much. I think it was not so much candles as you know, a dish with a wick in it, with the oil. But generally, I think they didn't have anything, Donald. No, they probably just used the light from the televisions.
It always intrigued.
Their mobile phone, you know, flashlight. What do you reckon?
There you go.
It always intrigues me what happens when it really does rain with a hole in the roof.
Yeah, well, it just comes in. And I think it doesn't come in as much as you might think. Like the Parthenon in Rome has that, doesn't it? And nobody seems to worry about rain coming into the floor. So the surprising thing is we're talking about this parish. It's probably the least populated of the parishes that we're dealing with in this series of talks. There's only a small number of McLennans there in the decade after 1800. 18 odd births. It's ranked number, I think there are 12 or something. So ranked number 16 in the births of the seven. You know, you got the big ones that we all know about: Compton, Gairloch, Frodity, and Applecross, and then these others down here. And this one is quite small. And I looked at, you know, is it an anomaly because they might have lost the births registers, for example, or whatever. But no, it continues on for a couple of decades as being this sort of number, 2% of the total population. However, by the 1870s, the percentage, the number, the ranking of this parish for McLennans is 6th. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's like here. It's like the equivalent of that one. So it's quite highly ranked. And the interesting thing is that while Gairloch is one of the parishes that stays in the top 6, the others, look at this over here. These are the others ahead of this parish in 1870. Inverness doesn't appear in the big ones there. People are moving to the cities, aren't they? Harris, well, that's sort of still there. So we know that people in Harris left to go to Canada particularly, and but even so, it's still there, highly ranked. Gairloch, you would expect that because it was by far the biggest there in that year. But then you've also got Glasgow and Edinburgh. So of the top 6, you've got the 3 cities: Inverness, Glasgow, and Edinburgh. And then a couple of others that you might expect. And then this one is the next. That's quite interesting, isn't it, to see the movement by the 1870s to the cities, but also to this parish just opposite, Inverness. So there's something there to keep them work, presumably. And McLennan is next in line there in this one. Kilmore, actually, there's here. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Thank you. So a couple of McLennans who lived here. It's a sort of illustration of what we've been talking about in the general. Let's talk about it specific now. You've got a John McLennan who's I number 194, and his wife Elizabeth Macleay had 7 children in this parish, one of whom migrated to Australia and died in Echuca on the border between New South Wales and Victoria. He was a weaver. So, you know, this is totally consistent, isn't it, with what we saw about the profile of people who live in this parish. And he lived in a place called Bog Allen, that was near Allen Grange. You know, we saw Allen Grange on the map. That's where he worked. This fellow, the next one, John, a lot of Johns on here: John McLennan, John McLennan, and John McLennan. This one was born in KNOCKBAIN in 1769. How do we know that he was anything really? Because this is well before any, you know, most records are kept of anything. because he was born at Allen Grange. We learn that from a poor law application in the mid 1800s, when his wife is still alive, and she says her husband is now deceased. He was born in Allen Grange in Knockbain, and we got him too living at this place in Knockbain, where there was a tenant called John McLennan. So that's an illustration again that, these are the sort of things we're used to seeing, expect to see. And we have another fellow, Donald McLennan, whose number I-823. He had quite a lot of children, all of them born in Knockbain that we can see, and all of them that we know their deaths for. Well, we know the parish that they died in for. Died in, because these are children born around about 1800, so we're unlikely to have death records, we know. The children that we know with the parish where they died all died in Knockbain as well. So you got the parents, both Knockbain people, dying in Knockbain. You got the kids born in Knockbain dying in Knockbain. So these are people who stick with it. They're probably the sort of people who won't adopt new practices. What do you reckon? They're stuck there, you might say. On the other hand, you've got the sort of person like John McLennan, this John McLennan, 778. And we have a lot of information about this John McLennan because we have about 6 books in our history section of our clan records about John and his descendants. And his wife, Anne McIntosh, married in Knockbain in 1804. This is the sort of time we're talking about. Presumably they had some of their children in that decade that we just saw a minute ago, the pie chart for. But they moved around such that they had, I think they had quite a few children, maybe like 10, something like that. But some we just know, a couple of them we just know the county that they were born in. But those that we know the parish where they were born in, it gives us 6 different parishes where they were born. That's how much they moved around. So there you got a sort of cross-section of people real people who lived in this parish and who you might be researching one day. That's the sort of thing you might find out about them. Yeah, illustration of just a snapshot. Okay, now we're going to talk about the fun stuff, the curiosities in this parish, and there are quite a lot of funny things that happen here. We've got the very important Ridge of Tears that we're going to talk about. That's the same thing as the Drumdurford Ridge. We've got a thing that's known as a Druid temple. We've got the Ord Hill Fort, and we're going to talk about a unique cave and also a Clootie well. And so the Ridge of Tears, let's talk about this. So this is the name here on the forestry sign. This is my photo. This is my photo too. This one here, we went to this place looking for some cairns that are well, known in McLennan history. And this path here leads up to where the cairn was meant to be. I didn't find it. That's the spoiler alert. There are lots of stories about the McLennan events that took place here in the 1300s, probably 1372 or 1374, that sort of date. And not to be confused with another battle that was a number of years earlier, a bit further to the west, a little bit to the west. But the various stories, some of them talk about the broken back survivor of the battle that was given to the boy that was given to the monks at Bewley to bring up, and that's the sort of one of the stories that often gets associated with McLennans. It may or may not be true, quite not very likely to be true, but I think it's better recognised that the chief at that time of the McLennans, Gillyfinnan, was killed in a battle there, as were many others. And this was a time when the Earldom of Rothshire was in contention because the former Earl had died, and it was the next in line was a Fraser, and the Frasers, of course, are based around Bewley, around near there. And the opposing parties in this battle were Frasers and McRaes against the McLennans and the others who were in support of the expansion of the Lord of the Isles, you know, meaning the MacDonalds really, were at this time coming to sort of muscle in on the succession of the earldom of Ross. And the Frasers and their allies, the McRaes, were quite successful. Perhaps they got the McLennans and the others drunk and came and chopped them up in the morning. That was the sort of one of the stories. Perhaps that's just a story. But the thing I noticed in researching this is that some of the sources talk about this as being the time when the McRaes moved to the McLennan territory of Kintail. Now that's a really interesting aspect if that's what happened, because we do know that McRaes came from the area that's known as the Aird in Inverness. That's a little area between Inverness and Bewley, just on the River Bewley, actually, just across the bridge there, in the under the aegis of the Frasers. So it would be a bit of a coincidence if the Frasers and the McRaes had had such success at this battle, and then soon after were found moving into the Kintail part of the world. That's an interesting thing to speculate, whether this battle and the Mackenzies moving in, because they talk about the Mackenzies marrying the McLennan women and, you know, making McRaes of them. Did I say Mackenzies? McRaes marrying McLennan women. Yeah. And the minister in the account talks about there being some stone cairns in the fields that are left there in reverence to the sheer slaughter that took place at the battle where these cairns were. But he's talking about the battle that I mentioned that's a little bit further to the west, that is predates this Drumdurford story about the battle there, not about the battle that we're talking about, which wasn't so much a battle as a, you know, getting them in the morning after breakfast. So it's so important that the famous, very famous, one of the most famous bagpipers and writers of bagpipe tunes, G.S. McLennan, George Stewart McLennan, number 11739, that he wrote a difficult to play, a pibroch it's called, pibroch piece, lament, that's called the Cairns of Drumdurford, to, you know, honour the significance of this event. And that tune was recorded for me following an event that we were the Clan of Honour for. I suggested, because we were the Clan of Honour, they might like to learn a McLennan bagpipe piece. And the band played McLennan tunes as best they could, but this was so difficult that it couldn't be played by a band, had to be played by a single senior experienced piper. And this fellow here, marching along, he's called Bruce Spence, now the late Reverend Bruce Spence, has died since he did the recording for me. But this recording is available on the music page. The music page has got a bit more detail in it now than it previously had. You can just go to the music link on anywhere on the Clan website. You've got that left-hand menu, not just on the genealogy page, but any of them. It's got music there, and you'll find this piece. I've attached it to that, a link about it. This is the Manning Pipes and Drums. You can see here Manning Valley. This was, you know, Bonnie Wingham, it's called, the event. So I got a tip, you got a minute and a half of him, this Don Bruce Spence, playing the tune that was written by G.S. McLennan, a minute and a half. Rest, just sit back and relax and enjoy it. Hey, I should say though, before I put it on, I happened yesterday to just somehow get a tip to YouTube talk about the Battle of Aldern, you know, in Nanshire, down there on the other side of the Firth. And he was talking about, this is called the Highland Historian, and he was talking about the battle there and how the story of that battle was transferred through the generations in pipe music, that the pipe music related to the events that happened at that battle at Aldern, which was, you know, where the former chief was killed in 1645 of the McLennans, and there were and from then there was no other chief till Ronnie, Rory's father, got to be the chief. And that battle, of course, is very significant to McLennans. It turns out the fellow, the Highland historian himself, is learning to play the pipe from an Andrew McLennan. So that's very fitting, isn't it? He lives in the Highlands, obviously, and he runs tours of Scotland, of the Highlands, and he was talking about this battle and the different aspects of it. But he made the point that music wasn't even written down for quite some years after the battle. So this was just passed on from one person to the other as a pipe tune to be played as a way of remembering that event. And in some ways he was saying the score or the music itself tells the story of the battle. Now that's a bit like a, you know, like a score might be written for like a movie, or, you know, a opera, for example. You know, the pace and the style of the music reflects the events that took place. So I thought that was very interesting. You might like to look up that, just highlandhistorian.com, and look up the Aldern battlefield. Anyway, I'll put it on now. This is the story of the Ridge of Tears, the Cairns of Dumdurford. Yeah, so that's the story of the Cairns of Dumdurford. Now, where are they? This is the question. You know, the sign I showed you a few minutes ago, that's there where this X is on this map. This is a map about historic buildings of British listed buildings. And this thing, James's Temple, we'll look at in a minute, is a well-known locality. You can find it and go there and that sort of thing. And I have a little book here that's written by a fellow from California who, you recognize the tartan, and you know, you recognize the picture, that's Rory's dad, Ronnie, inside. And then there's a, you know, the book is called The Ridge of Tears. So you think that the Ridge of Tears, and it deals with all the little battles, the battles that, you know, were relevant to the history of Scotland, including a page about the Cairns of Dumdurford, and it has an X mark there where the Cairns is meant to be for marking the chief's demise. And it marks it around here, this spot, right? So when I was there a couple of years ago, I parked here, went up that path that I showed you on that photo, walked up to here, walked around here, and walked around there. This is so dense, this here. It's a plantation area now, been heavily planted. And there are big rocks, not like little cairns, but great big boulders that are almost impossible to get through, and bracken and so on, and impenetrable, really. to get in anywhere there and find this thing. It's only a few hundred meters we're talking about in here, this area. So, but whether there's anything there or not, I can't tell you. I suggest anybody who'd like to go there and have a look, if you can get a plane, that'll be good. So that's where this famous cairn is meant to be, in here. Maybe it's better to come out of this direction. I don't know. But that's your challenge, should you choose to accept it. You can see exactly where it is, you know, this road coming out from Munlochy, and, you know, this is quite well marked, and you can start off this walk and go there. Sorry to say, I can't have a picture of the actual cairn, if it exists at all. It rather looks to me as if it's been damaged in heavy forestry operations, you know, just dug up a few rocks, get rid of them. Okay. Now, here's that James's Temple, though, which you can see. It's quite a big installation, 17 metres by 11 metres. Big slabs of rock coming down. This is not so much a Druidic thing. It's Iron Age thing, though, so, you know, several thousand years old. And probably, they think, used as a lookout spot for when these trees weren't there. They could look out and keep an eye on any enemy operations. Iron Age, about you know, 200 BC onwards, that sort of date. Scattered rocks, some of them falling down the steeper parts of the landscape there. Now let's move on to this other one, which is where we've been talking about, is up here from Drummersmittle, just up there. We're now moving through this little bit flatter, more cultivated area to the big hill we saw early on in this talk. This is the contours, you can see them here, showing the Ord Hill, and the top of Ord Hill here has a fort. You see how it marks fort on there? It's quite a big fort. They're often talked about as that the timbers are vitrified, meaning, you know, turned to glass from being so old. I don't know if that's true or not. Some people say they're not really vitrified, it's just a term that's used. To relate it to what we talked about in the beginning, here's Kilmuir in here, right? So it's just, this is steep, and this is even steeper. See how close the contours are there. That's 100 contour mark, 191. So it's nearly 200 meters above the sea level. And it's a much bigger setup, this fort here. Again, you know, Iron Age or Pictish fort, very old, with very steep sides, but 275 meters by 71 meters is the typical thing. And the walls of this fort, as you know, what's left of it, are 2.5 meters thick. So, you know, that would be quite an interesting thing to do, just to go there and see what that was there when any of our ancestors would have been passing by. That's quite good. And here's a bit of a two purposes in this. This is actually the site where the fort is, so you can see not much left for archaeologists to work with, but these rocks in here are part of it. And then some recent wag, you see, has built this cairn. This is what a cairn typically looks like, isn't it? And put that there just to remind us what a cairn is. A few handy rocks about. There is a cave actually just out from near the mouth of Munlochy Bay that is said to have been occupied by all sorts of people, smugglers and escapees and whatnot. That cave is another interesting quirk of this parish. And then you've got this other thing very near Munlochy itself, just on the road going slightly to the north out of Munlochy rather than down in the southwesterly direction. When I say slightly north, I mean basically west, but just sort of west-northwest, just a kilometre or two out of the centre. You've got this thing, the Clutie Well, and these things are found all over Celtic areas, you know, like Wales and Ireland and maybe in Brittany and Cornwall. You have these things where, I suppose it's a bit like the expression, time heals all wounds, you know. It's the hope that as the costs deteriorate, your health will, or condition will, ailment will go away or improve. So people come here with their cloths and they hang them on all these trees around nearby. They wet them in the well and then they hang them up all around about to let them deteriorate. So you dip your cloth, your clute, as it's, that must be the Gaelic word for it, in the water in the well, and then hang it up, and it will eventually rot away and disintegrate, so that you'll be better. Your ailments will be gone. And the forestry, this is a forestry plantation, of course, have a thing on their website saying you're very welcome to come and hang your cloths out at this Clutie well, but don't use any any man-made fabrics, because obviously they won't rot. The other fabrics, they'll just stay there forever. They want the cloths to rot. No man-made fibres. And of course there are many other, burial grounds and stone circles and so on in this parish, as you find in all the parishes. Yes, Melanie?
I don't know if this is true in Scotland, but in Ireland, the wells are there's usually trees growing near the wells that are, they call them fairy thorn trees, but they're a type of hawthorn, and they grow to a very great age. So they create this sort of mysticism around the space as being a holy spot or a fairy spot. And then they hang the rags as part of the healing that would be brought by the tree and the spirits. So it's very interesting.
So
They still do it today, all over the place.
Yeah, that's good, isn't it? People say how much fun this is to visit as a thing, like so colourful.
Yeah, and it's often old sites where old monasteries were, or where there would be like a fort or a any kind of very old site for worship or defense.
Bit of power.
Mm-hmm.
Good, thank you. So that's that's an overall view of this parish. The good thing about his statistical account is that he lists the advantages and the disadvantages of this parish, and I thought this might be something we could pick up ourselves, even if the minister doesn't list the advantages and the disadvantages, that we might start thinking about doing this for our future meetings as a way of sort of wrapping up and summarising what we've talked about. So firstly, the advantages, he talks about the big benefit of being close to Inverness, easy to get goods across the market, grain and so on, obviously is important, but perhaps also the weaving and the boot making was to supply the Inverness market. Easily accessible by the ferry, it's a good service and works quite happily. And the other advantage of having Ferntosh or Urquhart and Logie Wester so close as a customer for the barley to make their whiskey. It's obviously famous for the whiskey there. Plenty of stone in the quarries available, and also the clay for making the bricks is a good thing to make comfortable homes, and also for fencing, of course. This is before the time of barbed wire. So stones are used for fencing. That was a handy thing. And he mentions how close the sea is for providing food and also carrying heavy goods. So they're all things that we saw in this talk today, and advantages of being located in this parish. He mentions the fresh water as well. I think he mentions that mainly in the context of suggesting that there would be manufactures, meaning, I guess, mainly woven type things, like wool weaving or linen weaving. Maybe later, he doesn't know yet, but cotton might become something that they could do that later became so important in Glasgow and surrounds and Manchester. So water, readily available for manufacturing. The disadvantages of this parish are that, there is no fuel available in the usual fashion of peat or mosses, as they're called, that have been completely exhausted. So they have to buy coal to heat their homes and cook their food. No limestone available for manuring, as they call it, the lands, except for in these specific locations, but generally not much in the way of peat. No manufacturing in the parish, and as I mentioned before, he suggests some wool or linen might be a good idea, and with that he has the support, he has the quotes of what the Lairds say they would really encourage people to come and set up manufacturing. He thinks that the farms are too small and short leases are a problem that mean that tenants don't spend time developing them any further. And he mentions again this thing about the poverty and indolence of the inhabitants, which we're going to pick up in future meetings, I hope, and try and understand better what that means. So just overall then, these are the things we looked at in this parish of KNOCKBAIN. That means white hillock or knoll, previously known as Kilmuir, Wester, or Suddy and Suddy, two different parts. We looked at the statistical account and the FASTI maps and other resources to do it, and we were looking at the location and the produce, the people who live there, their health and diet and their housing, some of the McLennans who live there, the Heritors and the Minister, and quite a few curiosities. That was a bit of fun looking at the curiosities.